Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Sterling called her, the way someone might describe a mop or a cleaning cart, present but beneath notice. Margaret Walsh didn't react to the words. She never did. She simply continued charting at the nurse's station, her fingers moving across the tablet with the same mechanical precision she'd once used to suture wounds under mortar fire in Baghdad. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that sickly institutional white that made even healthy people look half dead. She'd been at Sacred Heart for 3 years now, and in that time she'd become the kind of nurse nobody really saw. The quiet one. The older one. The one who took the shifts nobody else wanted and never asked for a single thing in return. Her scrubs were 2 sizes too large, faded to a shade of blue that might have been institutional issue sometime in the early 2000s. She kept them that way deliberately. Invisibility was survival. The truth was that Margaret Walsh's hands moved through her work with a precision that belonged in an operating theatre, not a general hospital floor. When she checked for lines, her fingers traced the insertion point with the touch of someone who understood that a single degree of angle difference meant the difference between life and a collapsed vein. When she recorded vitals, every number went down with the exactness of someone whose charting had once determined casualty triage in forward operating bases. She was an anomaly here, a surgeon's hands attached to a grandmother's face, and she worked very hard to make sure nobody noticed. The scar along her jawline, thin, surgical, running from her ear to her chin, was the kind of thing people saw and immediately looked away from. Military injury. War wound. The kind of thing that made people uncomfortable, so they didn't ask questions. They just avoided her eyes and moved on. In the supply room at 6:53 a.m., before the day shift chaos began, Margaret held an equipment invoice up to the light. The paper was pristine, the printing sharp, the vendor logo perfectly aligned. Everything about it looked legitimate. Everything except the numbers. A basic central line catheter kit was listed at $400. The actual wholesale cost was $60. She'd memorized these prices years ago when she'd been responsible for medical logistics at Camp Leshan. Some knowledge didn't leave you, no matter how hard you tried to bury it. Her hands remained steady as she photographed the invoice with her phone, but her breathing had changed, shallow, controlled, the kind of breath pattern she'd learned in SEER training. Pain was data. Corruption was the same. Just information to be catalogued. This was the 47th discrepancy she'd documented in 3 months. There was a pattern forming, a constellation of overcharges that pointed in one direction. She'd flagged 2 orders already through the official hospital system, submitted them with dates and detailed cost comparisons and recommendations for vendor review. They'd gone nowhere. No response. No action. No investigation. Which meant someone above her, someone with authority, didn't want these orders examined too closely. Margaret filed the invoice back into the supplies cabinet and closed the folder labeled Discrepancies on her phone. She didn't know what she would do with this information yet. She just knew it was important. The same instinct that had kept her alive in Iraq was warning her that something was deeply wrong at Sacred Heart, and that wrong thing had teeth. She'd pulled a 7-year-old boy from under a collapsed building in the Jolan district once. His name was Danny Reeves, though she wouldn't learn his real name until much later. She only knew him as a small body wrapped in concrete dust, alive against impossible odds, his eyes open and searching for her the moment she cleared the rubble from his face. She'd checked him for injuries with hands that had performed 234 trauma assessments that month alone. Broken left arm, contusions, dust in every crevice, but his vitals were strong. His heart rate was fast but steady. He was going to live. An American Marine family adopted him 3 months later. She'd learned that from a casualty report she'd seen while processing medical records. Danny Reeves. The name had stayed with her through every mile of every tour that followed, through the incident in Sanjan Valley that had left her with shrapnel in her left shoulder blade, through the ambush at FOB Shank that she still couldn't think about in daylight without her hand starting to shake. She hadn't thought about that boy in 16 years. Not until today, when his absence had suddenly become present again, a ghost at the edge of her mind. She didn't know why. She pushed the thought away and clocked in for her shift. The ER at Sacred Heart was a controlled chaos of monitored vitals and practiced procedures. 2 traumas rolled in at 7:15, a car accident on I-405 that tied up the team until almost noon, followed by a cardiac arrest on the 3rd floor that pulled half the nursing staff upward. Margaret moved through it all with her head down, her body inserted into the spaces between the doctors, ready with supplies before they asked, out of the way the moment they didn't need her. She'd learned to be a ghost in these environments. The medicine didn't change whether you wore a uniform or scrubs. The only difference was that here, nobody expected you to be competent. Nobody expected you to be anything at all. Dr. Marcus Sterling entered the ER at 11:03 a.m., his white coat pressed, his hair perfect, his Rolex catching the light as he signed off on a chart. He was the kind of man who believed his own mythology, handsome in the way wealthy men often were, not through actual genetics but through the simple fact that he could afford to look good. Personal trainer. Tailored shirts. Dental work that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. He moved through the hospital as though he owned it, which, in certain ways, he did. As ER director, he controlled the supply contracts, the vendor relationships, the equipment budgets. He controlled what came through the doors and what went out. Margaret was restocking the suture kits when she became aware of him watching her. She didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that meeting eyes with authority figures only created problems. Her hands continued their work, methodical, practiced, professional. 16 gauge, 18 gauge, 20 gauge. Everything in its place. She could do this in her sleep. "You've been flagging orders," he said. Not a question. An accusation. Margaret's hands paused for exactly 1 second. Then resumed. The catheter kits, he continued, stepping closer. His cologne was expensive and aggressive. The monitoring equipment. "You've been submitting discrepancy reports." "Yes, sir," Margaret said quietly, still not turning. "That's not really your job, is it?" His voice had an edge now, sharp as a scalpel. "Your support staff. Supply logistics isn't in your job description." The invoices didn't match the wholesale rates, Margaret said. Still measured. Still professional. Cost analysis is part of. "It's not," he said flatly. "It's not part of anything you do. Your job is to manage bedpans and keep the nurses' station stocked. Not to question purchasing decisions made at the administrative level." She turned to face him then. She couldn't help it. Something in his tone, that particular blend of threat and entitlement, triggered a response that had nothing to do with hospital protocol. She'd heard that tone before. She'd heard it from officers who believed rules applied to everyone except them. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, and then she looked away, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. It was the only reaction she allowed herself. "I understand, Doctor." "Do you?" He stepped closer. She could smell the coffee on his breath now, and something else, something expensive and artificial underneath. "Because it seems to me like you don't understand your place in this hospital. Your place is small, Margaret. You're doing important work. Necessary work. But it's not the kind of work that comes with authority." "I understand," she repeated. But he wasn't finished. He never was, the kind of man who needed to establish dominance the way some people needed oxygen. "The orders you flagged are approved by the Vendor Quality Committee. 3 board members signed off on them. Are you telling me you know better than the board?" No response. Her hands had returned to the suture kits, her focus absolute, her breathing unchanged. Muscle memory from years of accepting criticism without response. In Baghdad, talking back to an officer could mean being reassigned to a unit without proper medical support. It could mean leaving men to die. So you didn't talk back. You accepted it and you moved on. What that particular training didn't account for was that Margaret Walsh had a 30-year-old shoulder still harboring shrapnel fragments, a nervous system that woke her at 3 a.m. with dreams of mortar fire, and the specific knowledge that whatever Dr. Sterling was doing with those invoices, it wasn't about catheter kits. It was about money. It was about the margin between what the hospital paid and what he was claiming they paid. It was about corruption, which he recognized the way some people recognized a face in a crowd. But she said nothing. She simply continued her work, and by the time Dr. Sterling's phone buzzed and pulled his attention elsewhere, the conversation had ended. Except it hadn't, not really. Because Margaret had seen the calculation in his eyes when he looked at her. She'd seen the moment he recognized that she was a threat, that her meticulous charting and her refusal to stop asking questions made her dangerous in a way that no amount of institutional rank could overcome. He would be watching her now. She would need to be careful. The irony was that Margaret didn't want any of this. She'd come to Portland specifically to disappear. She'd walked away from her rank, her benefits, her entire identity as Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh because the weight of what she'd seen had become heavier than her body could carry. She'd seen her first combat death at 24 years old. A young Marine, 18 years old, with an abdominal wound that no amount of field medicine could fix. She'd held his hand until his eyes stopped tracking. She'd seen 342 more die in the years that followed. Some under her hands. Some in front of her. Some in the dark hours when she was trying to sleep. By the time she'd come to Portland, she'd made a decision: she would be nobody. She would help people in small, invisible ways that didn't require her to be responsible for their lives. She would take her PTSD and her survivor's guilt and her shrapnel scars and she would bury them so deep that nobody would ever find them. And then she'd flag those in voices, because some instincts didn't listen to decisions. Some instincts were coded deeper than logic. Some instincts were about protecting people, whether you wanted them to be or not. She finished restocking the suture kits by 11:38 a.m. By noon, she'd moved on to other tasks, checking blood bank temperatures, restocking the crash cart, organizing the medication refrigerator. The kind of invisible work that hospitals depended on but nobody ever acknowledged. The kind of work that meant when something went wrong, when a doctor needed supplies in a moment of crisis, those supplies would be exactly where they needed to be. She was the foundation that nobody saw because good foundations were supposed to be invisible. But Dr. Sterling was still thinking about her. She could feel it the way an animal can feel a predator's attention. He was calculating something, weighing something, trying to determine whether she was a problem that needed to be managed or a problem that could be ignored. And that's when the pager went off, the sound cutting through the ER with its electronic wail, Code Blue, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 3 minutes. A critical patient was coming in. Everything else, for the moment, would have to wait. Dr. Sterling called an impromptu staff meeting in the Sacred Heart cafeteria during lunch rush, his voice cutting through the clatter of trays and conversations like a blade. 50 staff members turned to listen as he stood near the entrance, suit jacket perfectly pressed, smile sharp as broken glass. "I'm making a friendly wager," he announced, his eyes finding Margaret across the crowded room. "I bet this hospital's newest dinosaur, our dear Grandma Walsh over there, quits within 1 week. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the room like fire spreading. Residents smirked. Nurses exchanged glances. A surgical tech made a loud bet, $50 she wouldn't last 5 days. Margaret stood in the lunch line, her tray halfway along the metal rail, her movement steady and deliberate. She didn't flinch at the nickname. Didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge the laughter that felt like it was drowning the entire room. Instead, she took one measured breath, her fingers steady on the tray handles as if they were holding something far more fragile than plastic and ceramic. She knew what Sterling was doing. This wasn't casual cruelty, this was calculated. He was testing her. Measuring her. Pushing to see if she'd crack. She wouldn't. Sterling approached from her left, his shoulder deliberately bumping hers as he passed. The collision sent her tray clattering to the floor with a sound like breaking glass. Soup splashed across white tile in a Rorschach pattern. Her sandwich skidded under a table. A yogurt cup rolled toward the exit. "Oops," Sterling said, not looking back, his voice dripping false sympathy. "Clean that up, sweetheart. Wouldn't want anyone slipping." The cafeteria didn't go silent, that would have been too merciful. Instead, conversations resumed immediately, people stepping around Margaret as if she were a broken piece of furniture, not worth the attention. She bent slowly, her knees protesting after 3 years of pushing bedpans up and down these corridors, and began gathering the mess with napkins. A young resident walked past close enough that his shoe nearly stepped on her fingers. She didn't flinch. A nurse she'd trained herself whispered something that made her friend laugh. Margaret's hands kept moving, gathering, wiping, cleaning. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint. Pure, concentrated restraint. That trembling was the hardest part. Not the insult. Not the humiliation. The part where she had to stay still while every muscle in her body wanted to respond with the precision and authority of someone who'd commanded combat operations in a war zone. But she stayed bent over that tile floor, collecting soup and shame, and didn't say a word. The next morning, Sterling found his moment during rounds. Margaret was standing at the nurse's station, reviewing charts, when he appeared beside her with a patient file in his hand. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your charting flagged another equipment order, Grandma," he said, his tone dripping condescension like poison. "Maybe if you spent less time playing accountant and more time doing your actual job, you'd understand how hospitals actually work. Real nursing isn't about questioning supply requisitions. It's about changing bedpans and staying in your lane." Then he threw the patient chart at her feet. Paper scattered across the nurse's station floor like confetti, some sliding under the desk, others floating down with the slowness of snow. His voice dropped to something dangerous and quiet. "Pick that up, sweetheart, and stick to what you know." 2 nurses at the station exchanged glances. One looked away. The other stared at her shoes. Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath someone takes when they've learned over decades that the next moment will test whether they survive through action or through silence. A single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek as she bent to retrieve the papers. Not from pain. Not from fear. From the sheer effort of containment, the weight of keeping sealed what should remain sealed, keeping quiet what should remain quiet. She gathered each paper carefully, stacking them in order, her movements precise and methodical. When she straightened, she wiped her face without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her hand moved once across her cheek, deliberate, controlled. Then her eyes met his with something that made the air in the nurse's station change pressure. "I've sewn intestines back together under mortar fire, Doctor," she said, her voice steady and quiet, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Your cruelty is just background noise." Sterling's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion first, then calculation. His jaw tightened. The 3 residents nearby froze mid-movement. One dropped a pen. It rolled across the tile in the silence that followed, the only sound in the entire station besides the distant beeping of monitors. Margaret turned back to her work without waiting for a response. That was her final mistake, not knowing that revelation had just sealed her fate. That afternoon, Sterling activated his network with the precision of a surgeon opening an artery. He called David Chen, a board member who owed him 3 high-paying referrals from his private practice. He contacted St. Michael's Hospital in Seattle, the institution where Margaret's fabricated employment history supposedly originated, speaking directly to a former classmate now working in hospital administration. He requested an HR audit of Margaret's credentials through another contact, someone who'd failed her exam years ago and had been waiting for payback ever since. By evening, confirmation came back. No Margaret Walsh had ever worked at St. Michael's Hospital. Not 6 years ago. Not ever. The trail of her supposed employment history led nowhere. Sterling sat in his office, reading the documentation, his breathing steady and controlled. Not angry, angry was inefficient. Instead, he felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd spotted weakness and was about to exploit it. He had her now. Not for the insult she delivered, though that mattered. He had her for something far more damaging. She'd lied about her credentials. She'd forged her references. In the eyes of the hospital board, she'd committed fraud. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. But none of that mattered at 2:44 a.m. The emergency page came through the hospital's overhead system like a warning siren, cutting through the quiet pre-dawn corridors where only night shift nurses and skeleton crew residents worked. The voice was clinical, urgent, each word clipped, military transport inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Category Alpha Trauma. Marine Commander, multiple GSWs, tension pneumothorax, blood type AB negative. Prepare Trauma Bay 1. Margaret was restocking crash carts in the supply room when she heard it, her hands automatically checking airway equipment, pushing the medication drawer closed with her hip. She didn't hesitate. Didn't question. She moved toward the ER on instinct, older and deeper than her name, muscle memory taking over. The rotor wash hit before the ambulance pulled in, a sound like thunder made manifest, a vibration in the windows that made every bone in her body recognize the signature of military aviation. The rotor wash hit first, and for one moment Margaret was no longer in Portland. She was on a rooftop in Baghdad, 17 years old in her mind even though her body was 63. She was holding a 7-year-old boy named Danny Reeves, pulling him from concrete dust and blood after an IED had ripped through his family's sedan. She was performing a needle decompression with a ballpoint pen because there was no time for anything else, her hand steady even as the boy's mother screamed from 2 blocks away. She was carrying him 3 blocks to the combat hospital, his weight slight in her arms, his pulse thready under her fingers, his dark eyes locked on hers with a kind of trust only children can give to the person trying to save their life. The sound faded. The memory collapsed. She was back at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, the crash cart in front of her, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands were shaking, the first time all day, and she gripped the cart's metal rail until her knuckles went white. The trauma bay doors burst open, and a gurney rushed through with the choreography of controlled emergency. 4 paramedics surrounded it, one performing chest compressions in time with rapid-fire updates. The patient lay with his chest cut away to expose a sucking chest wound, his Marine Corps dress blue soaked dark, his face twisted in pain behind an oxygen mask. Margaret saw the boy first. Then she saw the man he'd become. The dark eyes were the same, even twisted in agony. The scar along his left temple, pale silver, barely visible, was the exact same scar from where shrapnel had grazed him in 2003. The set of his jaw, the shape of his hands gripping the stretcher rail. It was him. Commander Daniel Reeves, Marine Corps. 7 years old in her memory, now 27 in life, bleeding out on a stretcher. She didn't move. Didn't call out. Didn't give any sign that she recognized him, because he had no idea who she was. She'd walked away from the military when the PTSD became unbearable, disappeared into this hospital, and he'd grown up in an American family, earned a rank, become a warrior himself. He couldn't possibly recognize the old woman in faded scrubs who'd held him while he bled in Baghdad. The attending physician, Dr. Rashid, called for vitals as they rushed him to the trauma bay, BP 80/40 and dropping. Pulse 140, tachycardic. Right lung sounds completely absent. We've got a tension pneumo and possible hemothorax. 2 residents stepped back from the table, their eyes wide. Tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, air trapped in the chest cavity, compressing the heart. Every second without decompression was a second closer to cardiac arrest. The clock was moving. Margaret could feel it. Sterling appeared at the observation window, his expression unreadable, his voice quiet and measured. Liability is catastrophic, he said to Rashid, his hand resting on the frame. AB negative blood is rare. We only have 2 units in the bank. If he codes during our care, this becomes a military inquiry. JAG gets involved. We should stabilize and transfer to Bethesda. Let them handle the complications. Rashid hesitated, glancing between the commander and Sterling, between the bleeding Marine and the calculus of legal risk. His residents were watching him, waiting for orders, waiting to see if they were going to fight for this patient or protect themselves. Margaret didn't wait for clarity that might never come. Her hands were already moving, muscle memory decades old taking over. She grabbed the thoracostomy kit from the crash cart, the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the one-way valve, everything needed for an emergency decompression. She didn't ask permission. Didn't announce what she was doing. She simply moved into the trauma bay with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before under mortar fire, under conditions far worse than sterile lights and trained staff. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where it belonged. There was a hiss, the distinctive sound of air escaping, the pressure releasing, the pneumothorax decompressing in real time. The heart monitor's rhythm changed. The oxygen saturation began climbing. 68, 75, 82. Dr. Rashid turned to her, his eyes registering shock. Who authorized? He was coding, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady and flat. He needed decompression. He's stable now. Sterling's hands clenched against the window frame so hard his knuckles went white. But he didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't stop her. The overhead speaker crackled at 2:47 a.m. Margaret was restocking the crash cart on the third floor when the voice cut through the hospital's early morning silence like a blade. Trauma alert, all personnel. Category Alpha inbound. ETA for minutes. Military transport, direct from Joint Base Lewis McChord. Prepare Trauma Bay 1. She didn't pause. Her hands continued arranging the defibrillator pads, the intubation kit, the 4 lines in their precise rows. But her breathing changed. Something in that announcement had shifted the air pressure in the hallway, the way it changes before a thunderstorm rolls in. The elevator doors hissed open. Margaret pushed the crash cart toward the stairs, her worn combat boots, the only thing she'd kept from Baghdad, tucked in her locker for 16 years, echoing against the tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each step a rhythm she knew. The rhythm of response. She reached the ER just as the automatic doors burst open. The rotor wash from the Black Hawk still shaking the windows. A Marine in full dress blues was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1, his posture rigid, his face carved from stone. Behind him came the stretcher, and on it was a man whose ribs were caved inward on the left side, whose breath came in wet gasps, whose blood had already soaked through 2 trauma dressings. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. The collapsed lung compressing his heart. Margaret could see it in the way his jugular veins distended like ropes, in the way his breath sounds were absent on the left, in the way his oxygen saturation was dropping, 84%, 82, 80. She knew this injury. She'd treated it before. In rubble. Under fire. 16 years ago on a morning that had changed her entire life. Dr. Sterling was already there, his white coat pristine, his expression calculating. Get him to surgery, he said to Dr. Rashid, who was pulling on sterile gloves. This level of trauma, we're looking at massive internal injuries. The liability if we attempt field intervention, and he codes, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The subtext was already written, transfer him, let another hospital own the risk, protect Sacred Heart's metrics. Dr. Rashid didn't respond. He was reading the monitors, reading the patient's color, reading the trajectory of a man whose heart was about to stop. Margaret moved to the bedside. She didn't ask permission. She didn't raise her hand or wait her turn. Her hands were already positioned over the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact point where a needle would breach the pleural membrane and let the trapped air escape. She could feel the landmarks under her fingertips, the space between ribs, the subtle ridge of cartilage, the coordinates of survival. 14-gauge needle, she said. Not a request. Not a question. A command, the way someone gives orders when they know what they're doing, the way someone speaks who has already made peace with the consequences. Sterling's face hardened. Step back, Walsh. Dr. Rashid is attending. But Rashid was already handing her the needle. His instincts overriding politics. His training recognizing something in her movement that said, this person has done this before. Margaret palpated the landmarks again, once more, absolute precision, and drove the needle home. The hiss of escaping air filled the trauma bay, sharp and sudden, like a door opening to somewhere else. The pneumothorax decompressing. The trapped air leaving the chest cavity. Reeves's oxygen saturation jumped from 84 to 92 in the space of 4 seconds. His blood pressure, which had been collapsing downward, began to stabilize. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed to a steady rhythm, almost musical, almost human. Tube thoracostomy next, Margaret said, already reaching for the chest tube kit. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory that had survived 16 years of dishes and bedpans and anonymity. Prepare a level 1 rapid infuser. He's going to need O-negative, 2 units minimum, with TXA if we have it. Rashid was already moving. The nurses were already calling down to blood bank. The entire trauma bay had shifted into her rhythm without anyone saying her name. Sterling pulled Rashid aside. His voice was low but sharp enough that Margaret could hear it from across the room. Get her off this case. Now. This is a military commander, not some street trauma. If anything goes wrong, her head rolls first, and then yours. Rashid watched Margaret place the chest tube with hand steady as a surgical laser, watched her secure the tubing, watched her adjust the suction pressure to exactly 8 centimeters of water. She knows what she's doing, Rashid murmured. Sterling's jaw clenched. He left the trauma bay, and Margaret heard him in the hallway making for phone calls in rapid succession. First to David Chen in HR, demanding an emergency employment file review. Then to someone at the medical supply company, his voice dropping to a threat, the arrangement is compromised. She flagged the equipment orders. I'm handling it, but you need to know. Third to legal, requesting documentation of every patient interaction Margaret had touched in the last 3 years. Fourth to a number that made his voice turn cold and businesslike, I need a private investigator. Personnel matter. Credential verification. I'll pay premium rates. By the time Sterling returned to the trauma bay window, Margaret had pulled a chair to Commander Reeves's bedside and settled into it, her hand on his wrist, her fingers pressed gently against his radial artery. Monitoring his pulse manually. Feeling the rhythm of his heart the way she'd felt the rhythm of 1,000 hearts before, in places where monitors ran on generators and the only thing between life and death was what your hands could do. I'm not leaving him, she said when the charge nurse suggested rotation after 6 hours. The hospital standard was 4-hour rotations, and Margaret had already exceeded that, her scrubs darkened with blood and saline, her eyes tracking every breath Reeves took, every number on the monitor. Sterling smiled coldly from the doorway. 8 hours is a long shift, Grandma. Let's see if you make it. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She'd already done 8 hours in a basement in Baghdad with nothing but a field kit and a prayer. She'd already done 12, 16, 36. 8 hours sitting in a chair with fluids running and a hospital full of people willing to help was a gift. What she didn't know, what Sterling didn't know, was that the man in the bed had been 7 years old the last time she'd held him. That his name had been something different then, before the adoption, before the Marine Corps, before he became a commander. That she'd pulled him from concrete and rebar with bullets still hitting the walls around them, and she'd never seen him again. That everything was about to change. The clock on the trauma bay wall read 3:42 a.m. Margaret's hand never left his wrist. She felt his pulse strengthen with every hour, every unit of blood, every breath that came a little easier. And in the quiet of the hospital, with Sterling's calculations unspooling in his office upstairs and the real wheels of consequence already beginning to turn, she kept watch over a man she'd saved once and didn't know she'd have to save again. The needle went in. Margaret didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for Sterling's authorization or the attending's nod or the resident's opinion. The 14-gauge angiocath found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the hiss of air escaping, that beautiful, terrible hiss, told her everything. Reeves's oxygen saturation had been plummeting. 68%. Falling. His blood pressure collapsing like a building with its foundation removed. The tension was killing him faster than any bullet. She felt his pulse strengthen with every hour, every unit of blood, every breath that came a little easier. Hour 1 arrived like a calculation. Reeves's blood pressure spiked, 147/94, climbing, and his heart rate jumped to 142, tachycardic, frantic. The pressors weren't optimal. Margaret studied the drip rate, then moved without announcing herself. She adjusted the dopamine infusion, her fingers steady on the for tubing, her eyes never leaving the monitor. The resident on call, Dr. Chen, stepped forward. "Wait, shouldn't we?" "Pressure's climbing because perfusion is uneven," Margaret said quietly. "His left lung is still compromised." The needle bought us time, not solution. She didn't say the words like a question. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made these calculations before, in places where hesitation meant body bags. Chen stepped back. The monitor beeped. BP began to fall, slowly, carefully, toward something sustainable. 98/60. Holding. Sterling watched from the hallway, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. Hour 3 brought a different problem. Reeves's oxygen saturation had begun to drift again, dropping from 96% to 89% in the span of 4 minutes. Margaret was at his bedside before the resident noticed. The chest tube. She repositioned it with the precision of someone whose hands had done this in field hospitals lit by generator lights and powered by adrenaline. Her fingers found what 2 residents had missed, a kink in the line, subtle as a whisper, enough to obstruct flow. She straightened it. The tube began draining again. O2 climbed. 94. 97. 98. "How did you see that?" Dr. Chen asked. Margaret didn't answer. She was already moving to the next problem. Reeves's temperature was rising. 38.2, small elevation, but in a penetrating trauma patient, fever meant infection meant sepsis meant death, and sepsis had a way of accelerating that most people didn't understand until it was too late. She called for blood cultures before anyone else thought to order them, called for vancomycin and ceftriaxone before his temperature hit 39, before the cascade began. The antibiotics were running before the fever could establish itself. Hour 5. 8 hours total meant Margaret had been in that room since Reeves arrived, her legs stiff from the vinyl chair, her eyes burning from the fluorescent light's relentless hum, a coffee long since gone cold on the bedside table. She'd missed her lunch break, then her dinner break, then the shift change at 3 p.m. The incoming night nurse, David Rodriguez, had offered twice to take over. Margaret had declined both times with a shake of her head. At hour 7, Reeves's eyes began to move beneath closed lids. His fingers twitched. Consciousness was returning. Margaret leaned closer, watching him track between sleep and waking, watching his nervous system climb back toward the surface. His blood pressure held steady, 118/72, beautiful and stable. His heart rate had normalized. 68 beats per minute. His oxygen saturation hadn't dropped below 96% in 3 hours. At hour 8, his eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, searching, moving across the ceiling as if mapping a landscape he didn't recognize. Margaret waited. She'd learned long ago that the first seconds of consciousness were fragile, shock could kill you faster than the original injury, panic could tank everything she'd fought to build. His eyes found hers. She leaned close, her voice dropping to something gentle, something that carried no trace of the medical machinery around them. "You're safe, Commander. You're home." His vitals held. Pulse steady. Blood pressure unwavering. Her hands moved down to check the 4 sites, the catheter placement, the bandage integrity, everything perfect, everything held together by 8 hours of refusal to leave, to rest, to trust anyone else with what she'd already saved. Reeves's breathing deepened. He was falling back to sleep, his body finally believing it would survive the night. Margaret sat back in her chair. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From relief. From the weight of 8 hours finally releasing. She'd done it. She'd saved him twice now, once in Baghdad when he was 7 and screaming, once here in Portland when he was 34 and bleeding out. The arc of his life had bent toward this moment, toward her being here, toward her recognizing something in those eyes that connected to a child covered in dust and trauma and somebody's mother's grief. Sterling was waiting when she looked up. He stood in the doorway, his expression carved from ice, his arms crossed like a fortress. He watched her stand slowly, watched her stretch her back, watched her step away from the bed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His face said everything. This was not gratitude, this was rage dressed up as calculation, this was the look of a man whose control had just slipped through his fingers and who was already planning how to tear the world apart to get it back. At hour 9, hospital security arrived at the nurses' station. HR Director Patricia Moss walked beside them, her expression apologetic but armored, her clipboard held like a shield. Margaret was charting Reeves's final vitals when she heard her name called across the station. The other nurses looked up. Some looked away immediately. Some watched. Margaret Walsh. Moss said, "We need you to come with us." Margaret stood slowly. Her legs were stiff from 8 hours in that chair. She moved toward the security guards, 2 of them, their faces professionally neutral, their presence the kind that meant this wasn't a conversation. "The commander needs," Margaret started. "Dr. Rashid will take over," Moss interrupted. Her voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "There's a discrepancy with your employment records. St. Michael's Hospital in Seattle has no record of your previous employment. Your references don't exist. We need to suspend you pending investigation." The day shift had just arrived, 40 nurses and staff flooding into the station for handoff, and now they were all here, all watching, all trying to pretend they weren't watching. Margaret felt the weight of their attention like atmospheric pressure. She moved toward the locker room, and the security guards flanked her as if she might run. She opened her locker. Her purse. Her jacket. Her 3 years' worth of shift notes and a photo of her sister's grandchildren taped to the door. And at the back corner, sitting on the metal shelf like an artifact from another life, her worn combat boots. Size 7. Still carrying Baghdad dust in the stitching. She stared at them for a long moment, then closed her hand around her purse instead. "Personal effects will be inventoried and mailed," the security guard said, already bagging the boots, already treating them like evidence, like contraband, like proof of something no one was supposed to know. They walked her out through the main lobby. The same lobby where she'd entered every morning for 3 years. Past the information desk where volunteers had learned to smile at her. Past the gift shop where she'd bought flowers twice, once for a patient, once because the light through the window had been beautiful and momentary. Past colleagues who looked away, trained by years of hospital politics to recognize a firing when they saw one, to understand that looking too long meant complicity. Sterling stood near the vending machine, arms crossed, watching her leave. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. She hit the sidewalk and kept walking. Rain had begun to fall, not heavy, just Portland drizzle, the kind that didn't announce itself, just accumulated. Her vision was blurred, but not from the rain. Her chest was tight, constricted, the sensation of something collapsing from the inside out. She'd walked 30 meters before she realized she was breathing in short, sharp bursts. Her hands were shaking. Not the shaking of adrenaline wearing off. The shaking of humiliation finally arriving, of 8 hours of focus finally breaking, of everything she'd built in 3 years of anonymity being dismantled in 3 minutes of documentation that didn't exist. She was a ghost employed by a phantom hospital, and now the world was catching up to the fact that ghosts didn't have credentials. But that wasn't the worst part. Security's hand on her elbow was firm but not rough. Margaret didn't resist. She simply stood, gathered the single cardboard box containing 8 years of her life at Sacred Heart, a stethoscope, 2 pairs of trauma shears, a coffee mug someone had given her on her 3rd anniversary, things that mattered to nobody but her, and walked toward the employee exit with the kind of measured pace that military training never quite erases. The day shift watched. 43 nurses, 6 residents, 4 respiratory therapists, and the entire nursing administration stood frozen as she moved through the hallway. Nobody called out. Nobody tried to stop her. The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilators humming in the ICU behind closed doors. At her locker, security waited while she retrieved her jacket. Margaret's hands moved with deliberate slowness. She wasn't stalling. She was burning the image into memory, the dent in the locker where she'd bumped it 1,000 times, the small photograph of Danny Reeves at age 7 that she'd kept tucked inside the magnetic strip, the scratches on the metal paint from years of opening and closing. Everything ordinary. Everything ordinary always meant something only after it was gone. She reached for the boots. The worn combat boots that had walked through the rubble of Fallujah, that had stood in 23 surgeries under emergency lighting, that had carried her through 3 deployments and 6 months of therapy at the VA size 9. Tan leather cracked at the seams. The soles worn smooth from desert sand that had never quite come clean. The laces were actually paracord she'd braided herself in 2005, the last thing she'd made before the insurgent mortar round that had hospitalized her for 42 days. Security officer, a young man named Rodriguez who'd always nodded respectfully when she passed, reached for the boots. "Those need to come," he said quietly, apologetically. "Personal effects. Hospital policy." Margaret handed them over without comment. She watched Rodriguez place them in an evidence bag as if confiscating boots from a crime scene. The bag crinkled. The sound was small and final, like a door closing on another life. She walked out into a Portland afternoon that was already forgetting she'd ever been there. 2 days. That was how long before rock bottom actually materializes. She was sitting in the Veterans Affairs Medical Center waiting room at 11:44 a.m. on a Wednesday, and the irony was so complete, so surgical in its precision, that Margaret almost laughed. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and anxiety, that specific blend of antiseptic and human desperation that every VA facility carries like a permanent stain. The walls were painted a shade of institutional green that looked like it had been chosen by someone who'd never actually seen a color before. She was listed as a patient. Patient number 773 for 821. A number. Not a senior chief. Not a phantom. Just 773 for 821, waiting her turn. Around her sat veterans of every era. A man in a wheelchair missing both legs, his hands tattooed with faded unit insignias. An older woman reading a magazine from 2019, her military posture still perfect despite the tremor in her hands. A teenager barely old enough to vote, his eyes carrying the weight of places that shouldn't exist. They didn't know who she was. They didn't remember the hands that had saved them. A woman in her 60s sitting 3 chairs over, Margaret had sutured her femoral artery bleed in Camp Lejeune in 2004. The woman's eyes passed right over her. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the cracked tile floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The woman she'd given life to didn't recognize the woman who'd given it. That was when shame became a physical thing. The doors at Sacred Heart's ICU opened on the 3rd day, and Commander Daniel Reeves's eyes focused on something beyond the morphine haze. The nurse administrator, Rebecca Chen, was reading him the incident report, his vitals, his surgical notes, the sequence of treatment he'd received, when his hand moved. Just slightly. Just enough to stop her mid-sentence. His voice came out gravel rough, destroyed by the trauma and the intubation, but his words were clear. Phantom. Rebecca stopped reading. She looked at the monitors, then at the ventilator settings, then back at Reeves. Commander, your care team. Phantom, he said again, more insistent. The nurse. My medic. Baghdad. Rebecca's hands began to shake. She stood, walked to the computer terminal, pulled up his Marine Corps medical file with permission she shouldn't have had but exercised anyway because something in his voice demanded answers. The intake form appeared. Cross-referenced. Flagged. There it was in black and white, typed by a field hospital clerk in 2003, rescue and stabilization by Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Naval Special Warfare Group. Child presented with acute abdomen and hemorrhagic shock. GSWs to left flank, compound fracture left tibia. Estimated survival probability upon arrival, 14%. Senior Chief performed emergency surgical intervention and transport to CSH. Survival probability at CSH arrival, 86%. Rebecca's voice cracked as she read the name aloud. Margaret Walsh. Not a rumor. Not a story. Real as the scar on her own left shoulder. The emergency board meeting convened at 2:15 p.m. in the hospital's 19th floor conference room. By 2:20 p.m., a two-star admiral named James Richardson sat at the head of the table with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Next to him stood Marcus Holt, SEAL team leader, call sign, Breaker, a man who'd served under Margaret in Baghdad and carried 73 stitches worth of scars from missions she'd coordinated. Dr. Sterling sat against the far wall, his attorney whispering urgent instructions that he was no longer listening to. The hospital board members looked like they were attending a funeral and had just realized they were the corpses. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Admiral Richardson began, his voice filling the room like authority itself had learned to speak. Naval Special Warfare Group, 2001 to 2007. 2 Bronze Stars. He paused, letting it settle. Both with valor. The silence was the kind that happens when civilians hear the names of decorations they'll never understand. SEAL team leader Holt's jaw tightened. Rebecca Chen, standing in the back, closed her eyes. Purple Heart, Richardson continued, for injuries sustained during the Second Battle of Fallujah. Shrapnel wounds to her left shoulder and right leg. Continued duty despite medical recommendation for immediate evacuation. Dr. Sterling's hand moved to his collar, tugging as if the room had suddenly become too small. Navy Cross. Richardson opened the folder and held it so the photographs were visible. For actions in Baghdad, April 2003. Under direct enemy fire, SCPO Walsh performed an emergency thoracostomy on a 7-year-old male child presenting with traumatic hemorrhagic shock. Then carried that child through 3 city blocks under active small arms fire to the nearest combat support hospital. The child survived. He was adopted by Marine Captain James Reeves. He is currently Commander Daniel Reeves, recovering in your ICU. Nobody moved. Nobody could move. The math was too simple, too devastating. The woman they'd fired. The woman Sterling had called a dinosaur. The woman who'd been erased by forged credentials was carrying more valor in her service record than most generals collected in a lifetime. SEAL team leader Holt stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of slow that comes from having learned precision in places where mistakes kill people. Her call sign was Phantom, he said, his voice steady as granite. Because she appeared when everyone else ran. We'd lose people in patrol. Halo would be inbound. And she'd be there in the trauma bay, already knowing our types, already having the blood ready, already having made the decision that this one wasn't going to die. He paused, looking directly at Sterling. She saved 43 lives that I personally witnessed. She trained half the combat medics currently in Special Operations Command. She saved your life, Commander. He gestured to Reeves on the monitors. 20 years ago, when you were 7 years old, bleeding out under rubble, Phantom decided you mattered more than her own safety. The FBI agent in the grey suit stood slowly. Special Agent Robert Cross, carrying 6 months of quiet investigation that had been running parallel to Sterling's corruption, invisible until it was time to become visible. Sacred Heart's medical supply invoices, he said, particularly those flagged by Ms. Walsh, revealed systematic overbilling spanning 3 hospitals. 47 separate instances of billing irregularities across a 6-month period. This investigation has identified a $4 million fraud scheme involving these 3 facilities and 2 medical supply companies. Dr. Sterling is the common denominator in all 3 locations. Cross pulled out photographs. Emails. Bank statements. Kickback payments totaling $380,000 deposited into accounts registered to Dr. Sterling's spouse. Ms. Walsh's termination was direct retaliation for her discovery of this scheme. Sterling's attorney was saying something about procedures, about protocol, about wrongful termination claims and counterfactuals, but Admiral Richardson had already heard enough. His voice dropped to a level that made everyone instinctively step back. Dr. Marcus Sterling, Richardson said, each word precise as a surgical incision, by the authority vested in me as the senior military medical representative for the Pacific Northwest, and in consultation with this hospital's board, your medical privileges at Sacred Heart Hospital are hereby terminated effective immediately. You are not permitted to practice medicine in any capacity pending the outcome of the criminal investigation currently underway. He nodded to security. Escort Dr. Sterling from the building. The FBI will contact you regarding charges. Security moved forward. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. His hands shook as security positioned themselves on either side of him. The walk from the 19th floor conference room to the elevator felt like it took years. News cameras waited in the hallway, someone had called the media, and suddenly Sterling's shame was being filmed in 4K resolution, his attorney's briefcase blocking the lenses while reporters' voices shouted questions that he couldn't hear over the ringing in his own ears. Margaret returned to Sacred Heart on a Tuesday morning 3 days later, walking through the main lobby as the entire day shift stood and applauded. Some were crying. Some were saluting. All of them were finally seeing the woman they'd walked past 1,000 times and never actually looked at. Commander Reeves was sitting up when she entered his room, the chest tube removed, his breathing steady, the color returning to his face in a way that suggested he'd never actually accepted being dead. "You saved me twice," he said, his voice still rough but growing stronger. "I didn't remember the first time until I felt your hands." "Thank you doesn't cover it." Margaret smiled. Her first real smile in what felt like years. "You grew up strong, Danny. Your father would be proud." She accepted the Admiral's reinstatement offer that afternoon, back pay, a formal apology from the board, and something that surprised her, the opportunity to lead a new trauma program specializing in veteran combat casualties. She took the position. She worked part-time in the ICU, spending her evenings at Portland Community College teaching CPR to nursing students who hung on every word, who recognized something in her bearing that went beyond technique. In the classroom next door, Dr. Sterling taught CPR for minimum wage, the only medical work available after pleading down to criminal negligence and losing his license. His hand shook as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy. Every time Margaret's worn combat boots, returned to her by an admiral's personal order, echoed past his door in the hallway, Sterling's hands trembled. One evening, a student asked him a question about emergency protocols that he couldn't answer. Margaret knocked once, entered, and corrected his hand placement without a word. Then she left, her boots echoing down the empty hallway like the sound of consequences finally catching up. 6 months into their adjacent existence, neither acknowledged the other, though Sterling watched through the window every time Margaret passed. She didn't need to say anything. The silence was punishment enough. The truth wasn't just what happened when the lights came on, it was what you did when nobody was watching. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes hidden among us, the ones who've seen the worst and still choose to give the best. Leave a comment. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Like and share if you believe in second chances, even for those who don't deserve them.